Are you a beginning photographer just getting started with photo editing and looking for tips to improve your photography? In this video, I'm going to give you 5 common mistakes that people tend to make when they're taking photos, as well as some tips on how to correct them in photo editing software such as Photoshop. Hey, what's up YouTube? This is Susie with Gemini Connect. I run a photography production studio here in Seattle, and I also make YouTube videos talking about some of the tips and techniques that I use to run my business. Now on this channel, we are less about in-depth technical explanations and more about tips and techniques to help you get started shooting right away. So if that sounds good to you and you're new to this channel, please consider subscribing. So before we get started, please do me a favor, head on down to the comments below and tell me what photo editing software you use. Photoshop is one of the most ubiquitous and well-known platforms out there, but it can be really expensive and also really complicated to use. So I'd love to hear about other options, so let me know what you use. So all of my edits today are going to be made in Adobe Photoshop, but if you don't have Photoshop, then it's probably okay because these are pretty basic tools that you can find in most photo editing programs. Problem number 1. The horizon in your image is slightly slanted or just isn't quite straight. Now this is a super easy thing to do, especially if you do a lot of travel photography without a tripod, which is what I do. But honestly, even if you use a tripod, sometimes you can just make mistakes. So let's look at this sunset photo at the beach as an example. I'm going to open that image up in Camera Raw, and if you're not familiar with Camera Raw, then this is really what I love about Photoshop. It's a super easy and straightforward photo editing interface, which is similar to what you're going to find in Adobe Lightroom, but it's specific to Photoshop. And you don't have to have a raw image to get this toolbar to pop up. So within Camera Raw, you go up to the toolbar up top, and there is a straighten tool, which is a little hard to see, but that is called the straighten tool. And all you do is click on it and zoom into your image to where there's a horizon or a straight horizontal line for reference. And then all you're going to do is click and drag. And you want to make sure that the line that you draw is parallel to your horizon. And then just let go. And go ahead and hit enter. And your image has a straightened horizon. There's also another pretty easy way to straighten your horizon, and that's right next to your straighten tool. It's called the transform tool. So let's go ahead and undo all of our edits and go up to that transform tool. Go ahead and click it. Then you're going to see some options over here on the right side. So what I like to do is go over to that A, or automatic, and just go ahead and click that. And you can see that your image has been tweaked a little bit and your horizon has been straightened. Problem number 2, you have chromatic aberrations in your image. So chromatic aberrations are also known as color fringing, and essentially it's an optical problem caused by lens dispersion with different colors of light traveling at different speeds while passing through the lens. If that sounds complicated, then let's focus on what that actually does to your image, or how you might be able to recognize chromatic aberrations in your photo. To do that, I'm going to open up this restaurant image here, and we're going to zoom in to the windows. So when we zoom into these windows here and look on those edges, and you see that little purple fringing there, that's why they call it color fringing. And so chromatic aberrations or color fringing tend to happen in really high contrast areas. So in this case, the interior of the restaurant is relatively dark compared to outside. We have full sunlight, and so that high contrast is causing this color fringing here. Now in this case, the chromatic aberrations are super subtle, and if you hadn't zoomed into the image right there, you probably wouldn't have even noticed it. However, it's still there, so once you know it's there, then you might as well go about trying to correct it. Now to fix it, it's super easy. We're going to head back into Camera Raw and go over to this panel here and click on Lens Corrections. Now you have 2 tabs, and there are 2 ways to go about fixing this problem. The first and probably fastest way is just to click over to Profile and then check the Remove Chromatic Aberration checkbox. When you do that, you notice that that purple is suddenly gone. While you're at it, you can go ahead and click that Enable Profile Corrections, and you might see some small subtle adjustments happen to your overall image. So without Profile Corrections and with. Now, if for some reason you're not able to automatically remove the chromatic aberrations, you can also do it manually. So if you go back into Camera Raw, you can click this tab that says Manual, then go down to the Defringe panel where it says Purple Amount, and then just go over to that slider and then just drag it to the right. And as you do that, you notice that the purple is going away from your little window edge there. So it's doing essentially the same thing that that other button in the profile was doing. It's a subtle difference, but again, once you know about chromatic aberrations and you start to look for them, then it's really hard to not notice them. But now you know how to go about getting rid of them. Problem number 3, you have colors in your image that are oversaturated or just overrepresented. Now this again can be a super subtle thing that you don't notice until you start drawing your attention to it, but if we go into Adobe Bridge here, and I'm going to pull up my food photo of lettuce wraps. Now you might notice that this image has a bit of a blue tinge to it, and blue just doesn't really look good with food. In this case, it's really because the dish itself is blue and also some of the lighting in the area is blue, and so, but we don't want blue. So if we want to reduce that blue, then we're going to head back into Camera Raw and go up to HSL Adjustments. When you click that, you see 3 different tabs here. There's hue, saturation, luminance. In this case, we want to make sure that saturation is clicked. Don't do this with the other ones because that will start to mess with your color tones. But over in saturation, go down to whatever color you want to reduce or maybe even oversaturate. And then just take that slider and go down to the left. And as you do that, you notice that that blue tone starts to go away and we can focus more on the natural colors of our lettuce wraps. If you wanted to add more blue for some reason, then just go back over to that color slider and just drag it over to the right instead. And then those blues really start to pop or just get oversaturated. And you can do this with any of the color channels here. You can reduce saturation or increase saturation. It's completely up to you. Problem number 4, you had dust spots on your sensor or something was in front of your lens and it got in your photo. This is super common even for professional photographers. It's often hard to keep your gear completely clean, especially if you're out running and gunning it all day long. But this is a relatively easy problem to fix in Photoshop. So in this case, we're going to open up this photo of a bridge that I shot in Nashville. And if you zoom in, you'll see that there are dust spots up here in the clouds, and then even over here on the right. And they're pretty glaringly obvious, and for me, the professional, this is really embarrassing. So we're gonna go ahead and remove them. And to do that, we're not gonna use Camera Raw, we're gonna go ahead straight into Photoshop. And there should be this panel here. If there isn't a panel to your side, you can also go up to Window, and then just go to Workspace, and make sure that Photography is checked. And that will rearrange your workspace to bring these tools closer to you. They tend to go, I think, to the left side of your window. So now that your toolbar is here, go over and click on Spot Healing Brush Tool. And this new version of Photoshop is cool because when you hover, it makes it more obvious what those tools do, so that's super helpful. You can use the bracket key on your keyboard to adjust the size. You can go smaller, you can go bigger. But just go over to that dust spot or just whatever it is that you want to Photoshop out and just click that. And those dust spots start to go away. Now this is a really quick fix for something like a sky or something without a lot of detail. If you have dust spots over, say, like this detail of the bridge, then obviously it gets a little bit harder and more challenging to remove those dust spots. But this is how you would basically go about it. Now there's another tool that you can also use to achieve something similar, and that is the clone stamp tool. So if you go over to that one, you can also use your brackets to make that clone stamp smaller or bigger. We're going to make it kind of on the small side, but go ahead and hold down the Option key and click somewhere near that dust spot to sample it. And then I'm going to go over to that actual dust spot, maybe increase the size a bit, and then just start clicking around. So that clone stamp tool in effect is just sampling part of your image and using that as a reference to patch over the area that you're clicking on. It's a little bit more complicated than the spot healing brush, but it can also be more flexible if, again, you have a complicated pattern or something that's not so straightforward to fix. After you get rid of one major dust spot, then you might as well zoom into your image and pan over it, look for more, because odds are if you had one dust spot, you probably have a lot more. Problem number 5, you're not cropping your image enough. This is something that I know I struggled with a lot when I was first starting out and still do, especially when I'm doing travel photography or shooting something that I'm just in awe of everything that I see and I can't quite figure out what it is I want to focus on. So I tend to shoot wide so I can capture everything all at one go. But the problem with that is that it often leads to a lackluster image, or your viewer just isn't quite sure on what to focus on. Or sometimes you can even have things on the side that just don't make sense. So let's take a look at that bridge photo in Nashville again, and you can see that there's quite a bit going on here. There's a piece of red artwork, there's a building, there's a bridge, and there's also a rainbow. So there's a lot that's trying to be captured, but there's also, you know, like some remnants of some other bridge down on the right hand side, and honestly there's a lot of park on the left side, so we don't really need all of that. Open it up in Photoshop if you haven't already, and head over to your toolbar on the left hand side. Click on the crop tool, and then click once on your image, and you'll notice that some lines show up that go vertically and horizontally. So the rule of thirds, if you haven't heard of it already, is a guideline for composing your image. And so you can have this grid in Photoshop. You can also sometimes have it in your camera, depending on what kind of camera you're shooting with. But it basically says that if you place your subject of interest at any of these rule of third lines or intersections, then it really helps make for a better photo, because it draws your audience's attention to your subject a lot better. So in this case, the photo really does adhere to the rule of thirds pretty well. We have, you know, our piece of artwork over in the lower left-hand quadrant, and the bridge even goes over on the right-hand side. The rainbow even is up on this upper left-hand side. But to me, this could be an even better image if we just cropped in a bit. We got rid of some of this distraction that's all around our subject, including this little piece of bridge down on the right-hand side. So if we just crop that in, and we're still adhering to the rule of thirds, in fact, we're actually making it better. Go ahead and hit enter. And I think just by cropping this image a little bit, it adds a lot to it, just by making it more obvious to your viewer what it is that you're trying to emphasize and draw their attention to. And now for a bonus tip, because why not? Problem number 6, you're not shooting in RAW, you're only shooting in JPEG. Now this is a super debatable point. In fact, Martin and I have totally opposite viewpoints about shooting RAW and JPEG, and so comment below if you want to hear us battle that out, because yeah, again, we have strong opinions. We can probably debate that pretty well. But I'm of the opinion that you should shoot RAW whenever you possibly can. And here's a brief explanation about why. A JPEG is what pretty much every camera is set to by default. So if you haven't tweaked this setting, then your camera is probably shooting JPEGs only. Now JPEGs are processed and compressed within the camera so that you can print them, upload them online, do whatever you want with them straight out of camera. You don't have to run them through any editing software if you don't want to. You can still edit a JPEG file, but you have a lot less flexibility than if you shoot RAW. So on the other hand, a RAW file is an uncompressed and unprocessed data file. RAW files tend to be a lot bigger than JPEGs because they have a lot more information stuffed into them, so that you can have more flexibility when you edit your photo. But speaking of editing, you will definitely need a more robust photo editing software to edit or even look at RAW files. And if you plan to deal with RAW files regularly, then you want to make sure that you have a fast and modern computer that's able to process those files. Otherwise, it can take a long time. So to illustrate this difference, let's go ahead and jump back into Photoshop. I'm going to open a JPEG version of this sunrise photo of Waikiki Beach. And that looks pretty good straight out of camera. But let's take a look at that RAW version. It defaults to camera raw to give you some flexibility, but you'll notice right off the bat that that doesn't even look like the same image in a lot of ways. It's a lot flatter, it's desaturated, it doesn't have all of the edits that that JPEG file does. And this is especially noticeable because this was shot on a Fujifilm. So this JPEG file has a film simulation, I think it was probably Provia or Velvia, which really added a lot of saturation and post-processing to that image in camera. But once we start to go about editing this RAW file, you'll see that we can get it pretty close to what that JPEG file looked like, and maybe even better. Now the part to really pay attention to are these lights on the right hand side. You'll see that in both the JPEG file and the RAW file that they're really overexposed and really bright. So in the RAW file, we can actually correct that by going over to the highlights and dragging down the highlights so that we can see more detail in the street. As we zoom in, see, dragging down these highlights really brings back a lot of that detail. Compare that to our JPEG file, which again is completely editable if we want to. In fact, here in Photoshop, I'll show you how to open a JPEG file into Camera Raw if you want to edit it. You just go up to Filter and click on Camera Raw Filter. or the shorthand command on a Mac is Command-Shift-A. But here with the JPEG, if we zoom into these streetlights, you'll see that even if we drag the highlights all the way down, we don't get quite the same detail or the same effect that we do in the RAW file. So this is just a really brief example about how RAW files offer you a lot more flexibility when you want to edit your images. And they come in especially helpful if you accidentally overexpose or underexpose your image. You can oftentimes save that photo if you shot in RAW. Now there's a lot more to say about RAW versus JPEG, or really any of the points that I just mentioned. So if you want to hear more about them, then I encourage you to do more research on Google, on YouTube. There's a lot of articles and videos talking more in depth about them. But I hope that this video helps you recognize some of the common photography problems out there and offers you some tips on how to correct them using photo editing software. Thanks for watching, and I will see you in the next video.